Welcome to Therapy Inspired podcast. As therapists, we have a unique view of the world. We hold a space for grief and trauma, and yet we also get to witness resilience and healing, all while being human ourselves. We hope to share helpful psychoeducation with our insights from our world as psychotherapists. And now a disclaimer. We'll be talking about things related to therapy. However, listening or engaging with this podcast does not equate to a therapist-client relationship. And while we may discuss insights from working with various clinical issues, we don't reference specific cases. Hi, my name is Darby Crosby. I'm a registered psychotherapist, registered marriage and family therapist, and I have a virtual office here in Ontario. I see individuals, couples, and families, and I also offer supervision services to other clinicians.
And I'm Camila Osman. I'm a registered social worker and a psychotherapist. I have an in-person practice in Bowmanville, Ontario, as well as seeing clients throughout Ontario and supervising other clinicians as well. Today, we're going to be looking at conflict, and conflict is a natural part of any relationship, but how we deal with conflict determines whether it's going to drive us apart or bring us closer. If we approach it with intention and care, disagreements can actually deepen understanding. It can be something that bonds us, strengthens trust, helps us understand the other person's perspective and feel understood as well. And so today we'll be exploring different ways to navigate conflict that fosters connection rather than division.
So the first thing that we need to look at when we look at conflict is that it's not in itself a problem. It can actually be an advantage to communication and relationships. It's just the way that we engage in that conflict that really matters. So a lot of times people will enter into a conflict with the idea that I have to be right? So instead of it just being a discussion about something, instead of it being me against you, we need to sort of shift our mindset so it's us versus the concern or the problem, right? Healthy conflict allows both partners to express themselves really honestly and be heard and understood what the challenges are, right? The goal is not to win. It's really just to understand the problem and how we can find a solution that works for both of us.
Yeah. And I do notice, Darby, that sometimes couples who don't do this piece, this redefining conflict, may enter into any disagreement already on guard. And so if we don't shift that mindset about, a conflict is just us having a difference of opinion or a different perspective, and we can sit down and talk about things, then as soon as there's disagreement, we're going to slip into defensiveness. We're going to slip into feeling attacked and being like looking for that mental information to attack the other person. Our conversations will devolve. Do you see some of that in your practice as well?
Yes, I do. It's sort of like, well, he won last time, so I have to win this time. I mean, there's a lot of that sort of tit for tatting, if you will. And that already sets everybody up in an adversarial way, like I have to win. And so we're not as open to hearing what the other person wants or needs.
Yeah, and so just that simple mindset shift can make a difference. Approaching conflict in the idea of, this is just us having difference of perspective and we can communicate. It doesn't represent, so it's like there's some myths about what disagreements and having conflict is, instead of seeing it as us being able to shift and grow together. If we're looking at it in an unhelpful stance, it's conflict divides us. But if we can start to shift it to conflict can bring us closer together, working through conflict can actually be uniting. We may have a long, fulfilling relationship ahead of us. Bringing us to the idea of like how to communicate, how to have these conversations, and hopefully reduce conflict. Through being mindful of not hurting each other. How can we express our frustrations while we're opening a door to reach a resolution and not shut down completely? And one of the most effective ways of doing this to prevent defensiveness within ourselves as well as, with our partners is to use those I statements. I know we talked about that last episode. But just to review, the I statements are when we're talking about what are we feeling. So we're not using that blaming language. You always do this. And we're coming back to, I feel unheard when this is happening, or I feel frustrated with this situation. And so Dr. John Gottman, who has lots of resources on relationships. He actually talks about something called a softened startup and makes the point to note from his research that, I think it's 80% of conversations are determined by how they start. And so if we start with a harsh startup, that you language, it's likely to devolve and lead to a big conflict. And if we start with a softer startup, as he calls it, the I statements, and we're talking about, ourselves and what's going on for us, it's more likely to lead to those productive conversations. Aside from the I statements, active listening is really important, making sure that, yes, we're, sharing what we're feeling, but we're also willing to listen to the other person and listening for that understanding. We're not listening to respond, we're listening to hear and truly understand. And that comes back to mindset. If we're listening, expecting the other person to attack us, assuming, we know what the other person is going to say. And I know that gets really tricky. I don't know about you, Darby, but I see, and I think we've talked about this in the past, that the longer a couple's known each other, there's more assumptions around this. Have you seen that?
Right. Yes,
Yeah.
I have. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's this piece of just putting that on pause. Yes, they might be thinking that, but just being open, giving them the benefit of the doubt, the same way you might have been trying at like having the conflicts go in a different way. They're probably trying to. They don't want to fight with you the same way you don't want to fight. They want to have productive conversations. They want to have, if we come back to giving them that benefit of the doubt, we want to feel close to each other. That may help us be more present and engage in that active listening. And then lastly, it's to, give some room for, even if we don't agree, can we validate? So we may not feel like that if we're in that situation. We may not share their feelings about a particular situation, but can we give some validation? I understand that they feel like that. And it's not, we want to be careful with this. We don't want to get into, I understand you feel that way, or I'm sorry you feel that way. We're not using some of that judgmental language, but true validation may look like, I understand that this makes you feel like this. I see how this connects, like this situation connects to this emotion. And I see that now.
Right. And I think that when we're having a conversation and things are getting heated, we need to be aware of our feelings around that. So like if we're having a conversation and I'm getting frustrated, I'm much more likely to not be listening as actively and be more able to maybe take a little bit of a snip or something, right? To make the conversation just a little bit more spicy, if you will. And we want to avoid that too. So if I'm getting sort of activated and I am feeling more emotional than logical in this conversation, then I need to figure out how I can take a pause, right? Maybe I need to say we need to take a time out. Like this is something I do tell my clients, like if you're in a conversation and you're one or both of you are getting heated, call for a timeout, agree to a time and then come back and try to have the conversation again after you've reviewed your thoughts. Like what is the message that you want to convey and how can we figure out the middle ground there? And I mean, if you're not ready in 5 minutes, when you agree to come back and say, no, I need another 10 minutes or whatever. And I think that that way, then you're honestly coming to the table with a willingness to hear the other point of view, even if you don't agree with it. It gives you a little bit more space. And it's also sort of like, if we want to talk to our partner, it's sort of like, we need to be aware of, like Camilla was saying, we need to be aware of the way we say things. It's sort of like, well, we need to talk. If sorry to be sexist, if a female says that to her male partner, the guy's trying to figure out what he can do in the garage, right? I mean, he doesn't want to have that conversation. Very sexist, I know, I apologize.
Yeah.
But the idea is that if we set it up even before we've even started talking about anything, then it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to necessarily be positive.
Yeah.
So how can you figure out a way of having those conversations without using those buzzwords?
Yeah. What that makes me think of, Darby, is like that's anxiety right away. It's
Right,
not alone the defensiveness that we're talking about before, but like you hear those words and you're going to feel anxiety because
right.
usually, harsh things come after that or serious things come after that. As you mentioned the timeout, one piece that I am curious about is what's your take on couples who go to sleep even though if they're angry? Because we always hear that as a bit of a cliche, don't go to sleep angry. And I'll tell you my take, but I'm curious what's yours.
So I know we talked about this briefly before. So I think it really does depend upon what the situation is, right? If it's a smaller situation, I mean, you just need to sort of talk it through, like, sorry, I burnt the steak, whatever. And that became a big kerfuffle. And it can be resolved, then sure, don't go to bed sort of angry. However, if it's something a little bit more significant and a little bit more emotional and meaningful, like should we have children? Should we buy a house? Should like those things aren't going to be decided or fixed in one conversation. So I think you set a limit, you talk about it, and you say, okay, now we're going to just put this to rest for a bit and we'll talk about it again in a couple of days. So I really think about what it is, right? Because there's some things that do need a number of different conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that, and we'll often share that piece that it's okay, and it's not about holding on to hostility or anger, but knowing that our relationship is solid enough. Can we ground in the resiliency of our relationship that this topic and the conversation that we will have, where it's not that we're avoiding the conversation, we're just preparing ourselves to have it in a better way. So if it's 2 a.m., and I mean, 2 a.m. is way too late already, but if it's, after 10, I would say, that, even 9 o'clock for some people, depending on what you do for work, after a certain hour, know your body, know your mental capacity and energy. After a certain time, it makes sense to just take a
Mhm.
break. It doesn't mean anything negative about your relationship. You will come back to it. Your relationship is strong enough that you can come back to it and talk about it again tomorrow or whenever it makes sense to, as you said, a couple days.
And I think that that's the important piece. A lot of times people separate and they still have some emotional context. And and then we never come back and talk about it. So then it just always feels open. And I think that that's where we really have to look at how can we repair those connections when we have this sort of rupture, right? What do we need to do in order to come back? Do I need to sort of say, like I know when we were talking about this last night, I became very emotional or we were really at odds, like what is it that you want, what is it that I want, and how can we get a little bit closer? So I think it's being able to sort of apologize if we were out of line. I think it's important to sort of be really grateful to our partners, to have these conversations even if it was difficult, and sticking with it and acknowledging that you're both really working hard to try to come up with some sort of a solution. And like we were just saying too, is like you do have to come back, whether it's an hour, 15 minutes, or 2 weeks, coming back and sort of ending it as a strengthened couple who trusts and believes the other person wants the same thing in terms of um, healing and increasing the emotional commitment in this relationship.
And I think that's a huge piece of where we can turn conflict into deeper connection by showing that we are hearing the other person, we're valuing their perspective as much as we want them to understand ours. We are giving space for theirs and we're open to compromise. And so when we have some of those compromises, it's not, you're wrong and I'm right, or, I'll get my way and you don't get your way. It's a compromise where we both feel respected, even if it is more the way of the other person. Do I feel respected in the choice? Did I feel like I got my say? And, compromise sometimes we think is 50-50, but sometimes compromise is we're going to do the thing that I want to do this weekend, and next weekend, we'll do your thing. Or, the next time that this instance come up, we'll do it your way. There's different ways of reaching that compromise, but through the process of showing that good faith that, I respect you and I'm willing to hear your input. I'm willing to, take you into consideration. And you matter in this relationship. That's where we deepen our connection and we feel, there's a friendship here. There's a true support here in our relationship. And so, final thoughts in terms of wrapping up our episode today is to remember that conflict isn't something to fear, it's something to navigate with care. And when you approach it with respect and patience, even the toughest conversations can bring us closer together. Next time, we're going to be switching it up. I know the last few episodes we've been talking about relationship stuff. Next time, we'll be talking about our nervous system and understanding the body's role in mental health. If you have any questions or comments about our topic, something you want to suggest or just wants us to discuss, you can email us at darbycamila@gmail.com.